Thank you, member. I now recognize the member from Fredericton South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to provide a response to the budget speech for the second session of the 59th Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick. Je prends note de l'offre soumise par le ministre des Finances dans son discours de budget à propos de la collaboration sans partisanerie pour le bien de la province. C'était justement le but de la déclaration d'intention qui a été proposée par mon caucus et que lui et tous ses collègues ont signé. Comme je l'ai souligné dans ma réaction au discours de trône, pour qu'il y ait une coopération, il faut trouver un terrain d'entente et se mettre d'accord sur le rôle du gouvernement à promouvoir des priorités communes. Government's mission is in fact to protect and empower the citizens and the communities to which they belong. This reflects a moral relationship, Mr. Speaker, between government and its citizens, not a commercial one, as is the case between companies and customers, Mr. Speaker. Very different. Budgets for government are like annual blueprints describing how government plans to carry out its moral responsibility to protect and empower its citizens. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to take a look at how this budget protects and empowers citizens. To provide the programs and services that protect and empower citizens, government needs revenue. So where is it coming from? To redress inequalities among provinces, the Canadian Constitution requires the federal government to make equalization payments to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services with reasonably comparable levels of taxation. Equalization comes from the federal government's general revenue, which includes about $263 billion collected from both individual Canadians and from businesses operating all over Canada. New Brunswick will receive about $2 billion in equalization payments for the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Now, interesting enough, Mr. Speaker, this is very much the legacy of another Conservative Premier, Hugh John Fleming, who in fact ensured we had these kinds of equalization payments to ensure we could provide comparable services to our citizens in this province that are provided across the country. Now, Mr. Speaker, former Premier Fleming successfully corralled the other Atlantic premiers into a common front to effectively argue for meaningful equalization. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because it is true when you look at history that it has been New Brunswick premiers every time who've been the ones to lead the kind of common front that has been brought together to argue around common concerns, to push common solutions for our region. His success has become known by historians as part of the Atlantic Revolution of the 1950s. In addition to the $2 million in equalization payments, provincial revenue includes another $1 billion in transfer payments, of which $833 million is designated to help fund our healthcare system in this budget. C'est bien connu, notre population est vieillissante, comme c'est le cas ailleurs au Canada atlantique. Et ce vieillissement fait que nos coûts de santé sont plus élevés que dans la plupart des autres provinces. C'est un fait que le formule de transfert en matière de santé doit refléter. So I was pleased as a result, Mr. Speaker, to see in the budget speech a commitment by the Premier to seek a demographically weighted health care agreement from the federal government. But, Mr. Speaker, as history has demonstrated, to achieve this will require Premier Higgs to build that common front of premiers from our region to successfully press our case in Ottawa. So that's going to take leadership, Mr. Speaker. You have to look past the party labels on premiers and decide that to get this done, we've got to work together. And so, Mr. Speaker, that means rallying the regions, the premiers from our region, from Nova Scotia, from Prince Edward Island, from Newfoundland and Labrador, and I would submit also from Quebec, who faces similar challenges, Mr. Speaker, to build this common front to achieve successfully this kind of demographically weighted healthcare agreement for New Brunswick and for our neighboring provinces, who are all in the same boat when it comes to increasing healthcare costs that are being driven by our demographics. That's not the case in other parts of Canada, Mr. Speaker, and some provinces may put up some opposition to this. Really, that's why we need this kind of common front. And I think this is important enough, Mr. Speaker, that there should be an all-party meeting of legislators from all 4 legislative assemblies to start the ball rolling. What a better way to initiate cooperation around this and build the means for a common front than to have legislators from each of our houses of assembly in the 4 Atlantic provinces to meet together to plan that strategy. Mr. Speaker, the other $6 billion in revenue that was required to provide services and programs to New Brunswickers and to protect and empower citizens will come from taxation, about $4.8 billion, and other sources of provincial revenue, such as the $162 million in profit expected to be earned by NB Liquor. When it comes to taxation, I would submit this budget can't be considered fiscally sustainable, because embedded in the revenue are unjust tax policies. Prenons par exemple l'impôt foncier. Les citoyens et les petites entreprises payent une part démesurée par rapport aux grands propriétaires industriels. Saint-Jean est un bon exemple de cette inéquité. For example, Irving Oil pays $2.6 million in property taxes on its oil refinery, the largest in Canada, while we foot the $4.6 million property tax bill for the St. John Regional Hospital. Hard to believe, so let me repeat it. The Irving Oil Refinery pays $2.6 million in property taxes, and the tax bill, property tax bill for the St. John Regional Hospital is $4.6 million. Wow. Mr. Speaker, something is very, very wrong with that inequity. And that's why I say we can't consider such a budget to be sustainable when, in fact, you have those kinds of inequities in the system. Another example, J.D. Irving pays only $1 million in property taxes on their pulp and paper mill at Reversing Falls, while the University of New Brunswick pays $1.3 million in property taxes for its St. John campus. Mr. Speaker, these are millions of dollars that should be funding health care, education, social development, and climate action that are going uncollected because of the injustice built into the property tax system. Quand il est question d'impôt sur le revenu, on note le même problème. Toute proportion gardée, les citoyens paient plus d'impôts que les grandes entreprises rentables. Dans ce cas, le problème est aggravé par les pratiques d'évitement fiscal et les recours aux abris fiscaux dans des pays comme le Bermude. De toute évidence, le régime impôt sur le revenu est bien ancré dans l'injustice. I was looking for the Minister of Finance in this budget to announce an inquiry into the fairness of our taxation system, Mr. Speaker, because patently it is not. Instead, he said he will take a broad look at the tax system with a view towards creating conditions for growth through lower taxes as the objective. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a problem. In a 2016 study entitled Benchmarking Provincial Tax Burdens, the Conference Board of Canada reported that New Brunswick had the second lowest net tax burden on businesses in all of Canada. What we need is an inquiry into how we can make our tax system fair, not how we can further lower taxes that are already overall low. So, Mr. Speaker, we need that inquiry into the fairness of our tax system. We need that now, and only then can we say, once we have a just tax system, that we can move towards a budget that is fiscally sustainable. Quand il est question de santé, le gouvernement a le devoir de prévenir et de guérir et d'apaiser les souffrances. Mais tout le monde sait comment il est difficile d'avoir accès aux soins primaires et aux soins de santé mentale. Pourtant, le budget ne prévoit rien pour régler ces défis. We don't need no we don't need more pilot projects, Mr. Speaker. The model of integrated health teams with an emphasis on nurse practitioners working in 6 community health centers already operated by Horizon have shown to be effective in New Brunswick. So we've got the evidence, and we've got it in different regions of the province. We need to continue to roll these community-based health centers with the emphasis on health practitioners and integrated healthcare teams, integrated with those nurse practitioners. We need to roll them out. I'm not sure about Vitality Day, but I know Horizon owns something like over 60 properties that can simply be repurposed to host these community health centers, Mr. Speaker. So it's not a cost of acquiring new real estate in most cases. That exists. It's simply repurposing existing space, which I know is something the Premier himself is quite focused on the idea of. So here we have an example. We can repurpose existing space that the health authorities already own, that are largely being used by solitary physicians working in isolation, and transition from that model, from solitary physicians working in isolation to integrated teams of healthcare professionals. And Mr. Speaker, that's one of the issues with this budget I have, is that it really in many ways maintains much of the status quo without rising to the challenge of addressing some of the major issues we've got to address, like access to primary health care and improving that access, or access to mental health care and improving that access, Mr. Speaker. It's in some way a bit of a holding pattern. It appears mainly to enable to achieve the $23 million surplus, which is, of course, the third surplus we'll have in a row, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully we'll get away from this toxic, unproductive narrative of the province being broke now that with this budget we will have the books will be balanced 3 years in a row. The last deficit will have been in 2017 in the past, and we'll have had three surpluses in 3 consecutive years. Mr. Speaker, the lone nurse practitioner clinic committed to in the budget is destined for Moncton. That's the pilot project I was referring to. That location, while I love Moncton, makes little sense. You just have to look at New Brunswick Health Council's 2017 report entitled Being Patient, Accessibility, Primary Care, and Emergency Rooms. The New Brunswick Health Council does a great job of providing the evidence we need to make good public policy, make good decisions, Mr. Speaker, and their data should be used more regularly, and it's not, sadly. We've created this wonderful institution to do the research and create the evidence necessary to help us provide and help government to generate good policy, make good decisions. In that study, you can see what regions of the province have the greatest need for improving access to primary health care, and Moncton is not one of them. Greater Moncton is not one of them. There are many others. So I hope the Minister will rethink, as he's done with the youth facility for mental health care, the location of this nurse practitioner clinic they're planning to establish. What seems to be lost on this budget regarding health is that poorly managed chronic disease and untreated mental illnesses impose significant long-term costs for government and repeat visits to the emergency room and costs for social assistance and other social supports. The Premier says we need to get creative. Well, we do need to get creative, but I don't see it in the budget, Mr. Speaker. If chronic disease and untreated mental illnesses are imposing significant costs on the budget in other departments, then we need to tackle chronic diseases that are being poorly managed and untreated mental illnesses. And certainly one way to do that is to continue to roll out community-based community health centers with the integrated healthcare teams, Mr. Speaker, because they've already demonstrated very effectively they help people better manage their chronic disease, significantly reduce the number of visits to the ER and hospitalization, saving a lot of money in other parts of the budget. So, Mr. Speaker, that's how we need to begin to think across departments, across parts of departments, and across government. While I'm speaking of the Health Department's budget, Mr. Speaker, I do want to recognize the increased budget for addictions. Mr. Speaker, the budget for dealing with addictions, helping people with those diseases, hasn't budged for years and years and years. And I've made that point in past estimates committee and public accounts. And in this budget, it's going up. Finally, it's going up. This is so important because we know addictions, Mr. Speaker, such as alcoholism, which is probably the greatest addiction problem we have in New Brunswick, well, I know it is, exact tremendous personal and family costs, but they also, too, impose huge costs on the budget. When you're looking for savings, Mr. Speaker, it's not, everyone talks about waste and trying to, find efficiencies and so on, but really the big costs, the big expenses are being imposed by these kinds of social problems and health problems. And so the solution to that, to getting the budget under control, to getting our financial house in order, is actually to tackle those problems, Mr. Speaker. And so it's good to see additional money to deal with addictions, and hopefully we're going to see a major focus and campaign on tackling binge drinking, tackling alcoholism, Mr. Speaker. It's long overdue, and it will make a huge difference in people's lives, and will make a huge difference in the consequential costs on government budgets down the line. Bien que le discours du budget mentionne que le status quo n'est pas une solution, que les pressions nous obligent à changer radicalement notre façon de faire, que nous ne pouvons pas rester inactifs, qu'il est grand temps d'agir, sinon nous serons pris au dépourvu et devrons gérer les crises qui surviendront de plus en plus souvent dans la province. Comme d'autres gouvernements l'ont fait avant, celui-ci ne semble pas prêt, selon son budget, à modifier le système en profondeur pour vraiment régler les enjeux qui persistent. Mr. Speaker, it is, in fact, system change that we need. It is system change that the hundreds of New Brunswickers, particularly New Brunswick youth, that were calling for during the climate strike last Friday. We have a climate emergency which requires us to launch the transformation of our economy and society away from dependence on fossil fuels toward energy thrift and renewable energy use. Yet there's nothing in this budget to address this urgent situation. The budget speech claims that it's laying the foundations for a sustainable future, and it uses the word sustainable a lot. But when our climate is breaking down, a budget that does not respond to this imperative is laying the foundation for crisis, Mr. Speaker. Instead, we see government spending public money on fighting measures designed to reduce fossil fuel use, designed to encourage people to buy more fuel-efficient vehicles, Mr. Speaker, which is something you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. I don't see much evidence of that, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps the one thing the carbon price will achieve is encouraging that. Pricing. So, Mr. Speaker, we see government spending public money on fighting measures designed to reduce the fossil fuel use, like pricing pollution, or even advocating for increasing fossil fuels, like through fracking and shale gas development, rather than helping us actually reduce our fossil fuel use. Mr. Speaker, this kind of approach is what amounts to intergenerational theft. We need an effective public awareness campaign, Mr. Speaker, so New Brunswickers appreciate the urgency of making the green energy transition, understand the consequences of the status quo, and learn about the actions we must take and the changes to the system we must make. And, Mr. Speaker, in the budget, I saw no increase to the Climate Change Secretariat's budget that would enable them to deliver this, Mr. Speaker. We need to see effective strategies for growing energy efficiency and renewable energy use. but the Department of Energy and Renewable Resources has not been given the resources in this budget to develop and implement the necessary programs, services, regulations, and fiscal measures to do so. I note, Mr. Speaker, that the Renewable Energy Development branch that was eliminated under the former Alward government and was not replaced by the Gallant government, this budget still does not reestablish. So, Mr. Speaker, no one in government has the responsibility for advancing the expansion of our renewable energy industry or driving the energy efficiency of our province. The breakdown of our climate, Mr. Speaker, represents, in fact, a debt, a big one, that we'll be asking our children to pay if we fail to act now. Sur le plan écologique, le rôle du gouvernement est clair. Il doit veiller à la sécurité de notre environnement, protéger et rétablir nos écosystèmes. Mais le budget passe ses responsabilités sous silence. This budget was designed to reduce the debt by $49 billion, but it ignores, Mr. Speaker, the ecological and social balance sheets and the debt that have been accumulated there. So let me talk about the social debt. It is government's role to alleviate poverty, hunger, and homelessness, but I don't see any evidence of this in the budget. Last year's budget for income security was $239 million. That money was too little then for the people and families to meet their very basic needs based on the income assistance rates that were provided. If they lived in subsidized housing, that was a help. Made the money go further, but we know the waiting lists for subsidized housing are very long, so many don't have that opportunity. This year, the budget for income security has been cut by $10 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, if this reflects the reduction in the number of adults and children receiving social assistance, which is what the minister says, and I don't doubt her for a moment, why cut the money? Why cut the money, Mr. Speaker? That $10 million could have been maintained in the system to increase income assistance rates for everyone who's still on the income assistance rolls. Why cut the money? We need to raise income assistance rates so people actually have a hope of meeting their very basic needs. But $10 million is being cut out of social income security's budget line.
Yeah,
It doesn't make any sense.
not at all.
It doesn't make any sense to me. The rate of homelessness in New Brunswick has been increasing, as we've seen with the need for out-of-the-cold shelters this winter. Community organizations in our three largest cities have developed housing first strategies to end homelessness. They were hoping the Canada-New Brunswick Housing Agreement under the National Housing Strategy, which was signed last July, would deliver the funds needed to end homelessness. Because they have spent years now, Mr. Speaker, with their partners, developing housing first strategies to end homelessness. Strategies are complete, well worked out, budgeted. What they've been missing, Mr. Speaker, the resources to implement them to end homelessness. But the budget makes no mention of this. If there is money, as there is intended in the National Housing Strategy to end homelessness, if the minister has negotiated with the federal government under the Canada-New Brunswick Housing Agreement money to fund the Housing First strategies to end homelessness, the Housing First strategies are ready to go. There's no need to do any more work on creating strategies. They've been ready and waiting for a long time now, waiting for the money. So, Mr. Speaker, there was nothing apparently in the budget for this. And if it were there, I would have expected the minister to run the flag up the flagpole and say, yes, we're going to do this. Proud that we finally, after the years of work by our amazing community organizations in our cities, to end homelessness, strategies they've developed, ready to go, here's the money to finally implement them. I don't understand why the budget doesn't refer to this. Instead, the budget for housing services for this year is set at $91.4 million, down from the $100 million actually spent this past year, and down $1 million from the $92.4 originally budgeted for this current year, this past year. So What's going on there is unclear, Mr. Speaker, and I guess we're going to have to wait for for Estimates Committee to sort that out. And that's coming fast, Mr. Speaker, because, we only have one more week left to sit. One more week left to sit until May, and then we're going to go into Estimates Committee in April without the House sitting. Mr. Speaker, we have among the highest rates of poverty in Canada, yet this budget speech didn't mention the word poverty even once. Even once. How can that be? Conference Board of Canada, Mr. Speaker, did a study on the quality of life in Canada not that long ago, and New Brunswick's quality of life is one of the highest in this country. Dragged down by three things, Mr. Speaker. Three things. Our levels of poverty, our suicide rates, and the unemployment rates among our youth, particularly young male youth, Mr. Speaker. So we hear governments, whether they're Liberal or government, talking about trying to grow the GDP, Mr. Speaker, but we don't hear them talking about how to address those things that are dragging down our quality of life. Poverty, suicide rates, and youth unemployment, particularly young men's unemployment, Mr. Speaker. These are big issues and they need to be addressed. But the budget speech spoke to none of those. The financial impacts of poverty, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned about the financial impacts of other social and health problems. The financial impacts of poverty on health costs, education costs, social costs, and the costs of the justice system in this budget are huge. Those numbers we see on the page are considerably higher than they need to be because of our levels of poverty. Once again, if we want to get our spending under control, we need to get poverty under control, Mr. Speaker. We need to get the rate of mental illness and suicides under control, Mr. Speaker. These are the kind of things we have to get under control. And government after government after government has refused to look at how we need to restructure and change the system to fundamentally address those concerns and get them under control. That is what will ensure we'll have a sustainable fiscal situation, Mr. Speaker. That is what will ensure we'll have sustainable budgets, Mr. Speaker. If we can get poverty under control, if we can get the rate of mental illness under control, if we can get the rate of suicides under control, if we can get our health system working for all New Brunswickers, that will make a big difference, Mr. Speaker. New Brunswick has amazing nonprofits working on poverty and homelessness all over this province. La Péninsule Acadienne, St. John, Fredericton, Moncton, many other places. I would have liked to have seen in the budget speech a commitment to real partnerships with those community-based organizations fighting poverty, fighting homelessness, fighting addiction, supporting those people who have those diseases, to assess them in their work with those vulnerable parts of our population. The social and personal costs of poverty are just brutal. And we see that in our constituency offices, Mr. Speaker. That's what just slays me. I do not understand, given what each of us, the people we work with in our constituency offices week in and week out and what they're facing, why that doesn't translate into good ideas and real action in this legislative assembly and in government. One thing that can be done to give poor children a fighting chance at school is to feed them so they're not hungry through the day. It would have been good to see a commitment in the budget to supporting the work of groups like Nourishing Minds, who are dedicated to stamping out hunger from our schools, Mr. Speaker, but no mention of that. Another role of government, Mr. Speaker, is to help care for those who cannot care for themselves. And I'm not talking, Mr. Speaker, about what sounds in the budget speech like a slush fund for MLAs. I must say I was a bit gobsmacked to see a mention of this fund for MLAs that would allow individual MLAs to have money that they would hand out to support projects in their communities. Mr. Speaker, I thought we were well beyond that when we ended that practice with the SEED program, Mr. Speaker. When the former government ended that practice, I say we as the legislature, but the former government initiated that, Mr. Speaker, and I had advocated that for a long time. And here we have this boneheaded reopening of the door to MLAs dishing out public money to support their re-election. It's a scandal. It's a scandal. It's embarrassing, Madam Speaker. It's embarrassing as a parliamentarian to have such a commitment in this budget speech. Embarrassing. Mr. Speaker, we have seniors who need help to stay in their homes or are waiting for a bed in a nursing home, waiting in hospitals where no one should be forced to live. Or we've got people with disabilities in the same situation who need to be helped to be safely and securely housed, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. And so we need to place far more emphasis on that role of government to help care for those who cannot care for themselves. So I will say, Madam Speaker, I was glad to see the commitment in the budget speech of $16 million to improve the wages of some care workers, and it's unclear. And perhaps we'll get the answer in question period next week. But, Mr. Speaker, that $16 million in the English version of the budget, Madam Speaker, I'm sorry, the $16 million in the budget speech in English says it's for home care workers. And the French version of the budget speech says it's for home care and nursing home workers. So I'm not sure which it is, Madam Speaker, but it does make a difference. Because if it's $16 million for home care workers, then that means more substantial increases to their wages than if it's going to have to be divided among other care workers, nursing home workers, from this pot of money, and special care home workers. So that needs to be clarified. So we need to know which is the case. Madam Speaker, government has also a role in protecting and empowering New Brunswickers to create an educated population. And it's good to see that the tuition tax credit was reinstated to help those pursuing a post-secondary education. So I applaud the government for doing that. It was a mistake to take it away, and I'm pleased to see they put it back, so good on them. However, it remains unclear whether the free tuition program will continue in the same manner. Now again, I'm supportive of the government's decision to, as they say, maintain the free tuition program. But I'm a little nervous about the details because the details aren't there. And when I've asked questions, Madam Speaker, there's a bit of stick handling. So I'm wondering how it will change. The speech talks about unveiling a renewed bursary program. So it's being extended to students who are attending private college. It's a good thing. That should happen, Madam Speaker. Will the renewal include other positive improvements? I hope so, like removing the credit check that currently is in place for people seeking the free tuition program. Doesn't make any sense. Someone should have to go through a credit check for a bursary, for free tuition. And it's aimed at a population where you're going to have lots of people whose credit's not going to look so hot at a credit check. So we'll see. Madam Speaker, government also has a role to build and maintain infrastructure in protecting and empowering New Brunswickers. And I'm reminded daily about the cuts to infrastructure that have been made when I walk by the Centennial Building. Everyone seems to agree, including the government, that there needs to be a new Justice Building at some point, Madam Speaker. So I would encourage the government to consider renovating the Centennial Building so that it can house our courts. Okay, if the addition's not on, that was going to be built in the parking lot behind the Centennial Building, there was going to be offices in the front of the Centennial Building, why can't we renovate? It's been gutted already. We've already put a lot of money into it. Why can't we renovate the existing Centennial Building as it is and turn those into our new Justice Building with new courthouses? That would be great. Repurposing the building, we're not wasting it, we own it, we're not having to buy anything new, we're not having to find new land. Great way to save money. So I hope that the government considers that.
I had to go.
It's also, by the way, a greener approach, Mr. Speaker, when we repurpose buildings rather than tearing them down and building new. So certainly I would stand behind that as well. With respect to infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, public transportation services are also much needed. It's time we start regarding public transport as essential infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, intense weather and climate change are causing more people to look to alternatives to driving. And the same can be said for our aging population. And there are large numbers in New Brunswick who just can't afford to own their own car. But I note in the budget there's no public funding for public transportation this time around, again, and even no public funding from the federal government this time. So we remain one of the few provinces that don't directly support public transportation in our budgets. Government has a role to promote the arts, Mr. Speaker, but the budget does not touch on the arts at all. Our musicians, actors, writers, painters, filmmakers, poets, and artisans must be wondering why. Or perhaps they are just relieved that the arts budget escaped relatively unscathed while money for tourism in that department was severely cut. Regarding economic development, Mr. Speaker, the budget gives a nod to future reductions in taxes, as if that has actually been proven to drive economic development. Sean Graham tried this, and it precipitated the debt hole we now are trying to dig ourselves out of. Yeah, well, remember, Sean Graham brought in massive tax cuts, took a huge chunk of revenue out of the budget. What he was thinking on in his government, I have no idea, and that precipitated the downward slide into the debt hole we found ourselves in. Subsequent governments of Mr. Allward dug the hole deeper, and there we are with our big debt. But, Mr. Speaker, what has proven to drive economic development, in fact, is to take concrete action to replace imported goods and services with local ones. We've been so overly focused on the export of resource commodities whose value is dependent on international prices and the volatility of export markets to the detriment of our domestic economy. So look at Nova Scotia. They supply 70% of the goods and services they require in their province, from the businesses in their province, from the cooperative enterprises in their province, from the social enterprises in their province. Where in New Brunswick it's less than 60%. So less than 60% of what we require in goods and services in this province are produced in the province by New Brunswickers. So we need to change that. That's what will drive economic development, and not just in a few areas, Mr. Speaker, but all around the province. All around the province. Be a huge help for northern New Brunswick, which needs considerable help with economic development these days. The future lies, Mr. Speaker, in building a greener economy that is more localized. Too much wealth is being diverted from New Brunswick to other provinces and other countries through our purchase of imported goods and services, which we could produce here. In doing so, we would create wealth in our local communities by replacing imports in goods and services and produce them sustainably in New Brunswick. According to the Centre for Local Prosperity in Nova Scotia, when they looked at New Brunswick, if we consume just 10% more locally produced goods and services instead of importing them, there would be 14,500 more jobs, almost $1 billion in new wages, and a 1.8 billion increase in the GDP. What we need, Mr. Speaker, to drive economic development is new thinking like this, is green thinking like this, Mr. Speaker. And that's what we need, Mr. Speaker, a comprehensive strategy for import replacement. Local food, locally produced renewable energy immediately come to mind as priorities which we get to work on right away. Mr. Speaker, we will be spending 80 hours examining the budget in committee, voting on each department's estimates. I truly hope that this time, government will facilitate the committee's work by providing it with the detailed departmental budgets. Mr. Speaker, it is extremely frustrating, as the members opposite will remember when they were in opposition on committee, to try and do a good job in estimates committee when you don't have the detailed budgets from the departments. You're required to go on a fishing expedition, Mr. Speaker. Why should we be fishing from this side of the House to find out what's in the departmental budgets to ask our questions? If we had the numbers, if we had the breakdown, then we could ask much better questions, we could have much better discussion, and maybe we'll end up with a much better budget. So, Mr. Speaker, I hold out that hope. The Premier has said in his throne speech and has repeatedly said he wants to see the legislature work better. So there's a test. let's see if we can get those departmental budgets distributed to committee members so we have the details we need to do our work on behalf of New Brunswickers. And Mr. Speaker, that will, as I said, lead to a productive debate, I believe, a meaningful debate. And meaningful debate, Mr. Speaker, is what we should conduct in this House always. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup.